access to a mic. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lace Padilla. She's an assistant professor in the Cognitive and Information Sciences Department at the University of California, Merced, and was an NSF postdoctoral scholar at Northwestern University. She and collaborators have received multiple grants from NSF and DOE to study uncertainty communication in the context of COVID-19, wildfire risk, and energy grids. In her spare time, she's a strong advocate for minority groups in STEM. She served on the governing board of the Spark Society and the IEEE Viz Inclusivity Committee. Generally, I only invite speakers who I know personally or who I have heard, but she was suggested to me, and luckily I found YouTubes of her work on the web. And judging from what I saw, I think you're in for a real treat tonight. It's all yours, Lace.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me. I was very excited to see this invite. To begin, I want to say that in addition to caring about how we visualize data, I'm a cognitive scientist. So I'm also deeply fascinated by how the mind represents information and how we can use that to make better data visualizations. So what you're going to hear today that might be a little different is more about how the mind reasons and makes decisions with visual information and what that can tell us to make better and more clear visualizations. I thought we would start with some data visualizations that we've all thought deeply about in the last few years. Here we have incident weekly deaths in New York, and I pulled this from today. And this is date plotted down here. And what I'm showing you in terms of this line is a mean predicted forecast from today's date. And I'd like you to answer the question for yourself. Is the COVID risk in New York actually decreasing, increasing, or staying the same? Of course, this is the type of decision that we've all made for the last 2 years, so you should be fairly familiar with this type of decision. But what if we change the visualization technique and we add a 50% confidence interval? Now, my prediction on the previous graph was that the COVID risk is probably going down and maybe staying the same. When we add this 50% confidence interval, my prediction doesn't really change at all. If we bump that up to a 95% confidence interval, now we're getting in a territory where there could be possible different outcomes that we weren't aware of when we just saw the mean or a lower interval prediction, such as staying the same, going down, maybe even increasing a little bit. Now, of course, we can show multiple model forecasts. And to be clear, these are different models from different forecasting groups. And the mean that I had shown you originally was an ensemble prediction that was the average of all of these different models. And the models vary in terms of their initial conditions and their assumptions about COVID-19. The really amazing part about showing more of the underlying data that communicates a distribution is that our visual system, our eye-brain connection, has evolved to find patterns in data very easily. So we can very clearly see where most of these lines are grouped up, which is excellent. Now, of course, we could do something crazy like add confidence intervals to that. Of course, no one would do that. But here's one of my favorite techniques, and I will tell you throughout this talk why I think this is such an interesting approach, which is to take a subset of all of the possible models and do it in some type of systematic way where you have an expert select the models for various properties, and to do that to represent the entire distribution, but allow people to see where the most likely direction that the risk could potentially go in. The really nice thing about this type of visualization is that the uncertainty is being communicated inherently. You have to build up the uncertainty in your mind by comparing the different possible outcomes rather than being shown the uncertainty explicitly in an interval. My main point here is that if you see any of these different types of visualizations, you might come to very different conclusions about your risk of COVID-19 and might take very different actions. In addition, some types of visualizations confront you with the uncertainty. And I would argue that accepting the possibility of an extreme outcome is how we become resilient to uncertainty. And that really needs to be one of our goals moving forward as a society, because due to climate change and other factors, we're going to experience a rise in the frequency of severity and variable events. So we really need to become accustomed to experiencing uncertainty. And I hope you can see that with this 7 model visualization, it is at least making you aware that there could be uncertainty. And while the COVID risk is probably going to go down, there is a possibility that given some different conditions that it could rise again. What I'm going to talk about today is that the way uncertainty is presented has a profound influence on our judgments. And as a cognitive scientist, I'm going to use a model like this that helps us break apart different reasoning processes that go on in the mind. And to be clear, in cognitive science, each of these little boxes represents a whole field, and this figure really summarizes how we make decisions with visualizations. And I'll walk you through part of it. It starts here with a visual array, a very jargony term for a visualization. It ends in a behavior. And I want to focus your attention just on this part of the model to start. It is what's called a visual description. And this is really the pure information that you can extract from a visualization before you start doing more complex things like using your past experiences and long-term knowledge. Just what can you pull from the visualization itself? I'm also going to use this figure from a paper that we recently published where we summarize all of the modern research on uncertainty visualization. Let's start here with intervals and ratios. This tends to be the most common visualizations shown to the public. Okay, so here we have 2 95% confidence intervals. If you saw this online or in some type of publication, you might think these are 2 very similar intervals. Maybe they're based on the same data, maybe very, very similar underlying conditions went into these intervals. If you thought that, you'd be very wrong. The one on the top is based on a pseudo-normal distribution, and the one on the bottom has a bimodal distribution. Now, right out of the gate, these summaries of distributional data can hide important features of the data. And that can be a problem because as a cognitive scientist, what we know people are doing is when they see an interval like this, they in their mind have to imagine the underlying distribution. It's not given to them. And the way they imagine that will be different if they're presented a 95% confidence interval or a 66% or a 33%. And the truth is there's nothing special about 95%. I'm showing you examples here of the National Hurricane Center, who uses a 66% confidence interval. The International Panel on Climate Change uses a 90%, and there was some earlier versions of visualizations on the CDC's website that use 50% confidence intervals. So it can be really tricky as a viewer to somehow imagine what the distribution would be if you're given these ranges of intervals. And that leads me to my first big concept, which is that intervals create conceptual categories. And I'll give you some evidence from empirical research on why I think that is the case. Here is the cone of uncertainty. We have so many people from different areas joining us. I'm sure some of you have experienced hurricanes before. What this cone is intended to show is the general path or trajectory of the storm. It's based on a pseudo-normal distribution, and that center line is the mean path, the most likely path that the storm will take. Here on the edge of the cone, it's a 66% confidence interval or an envelope around the mean path. Now we present this to participants in lab studies, and we want to understand how they interpret these visualizations. So one of the things that we do in the past is we try to have people do what's called a behavioral judgment, meaning we're trying to get how they would behave if they saw one of these visualizations, rather than having people do a probabilistic judgment, because people are so bad at reasoning with probabilities. For example, I would never ask you or a participant, what's the likelihood that this storm would hit Louisiana? I would only be measuring how good they are with numbers, really. So in this case, what we do is we present a scale to them, with 1 being no damage and 7 being severe damage. We show them a location on this hurricane map, and they estimate the damage that would occur to that particular location. And we do this in this experiment with students at the University of Utah, that happens to be a very landlocked state in the US, because we want to know what information they're getting from the visualization itself. We don't necessarily at this point want to know about their prior experiences with hurricanes. And that's also why we gave very minimal descriptions of the visualization, because we're focusing on this part of the model, just what can they ascertain from the image without some of these additional processes. So we've compared this cone of uncertainty to a version that my collaborators created called an ensemble display. Here's how they generate this. They take the same initial modeling procedure as the cone of uncertainty, and they make small perturbations to their model that they sample. And each one of these lines represents one sample from that perturbation space. And it's fairly intuitive when you see animated like this, that you should focus on where most of the lines are grouped together. But when you see a line kind of swing down towards Florida or towards some of those other smaller areas, that those are outliers pulled from normal distributions of data. That statistical property of understanding distributions and so forth can be very complicated, but this visualization is rather intuitive in that your attention is drawn to the most likely path that the storm will potentially take. So in the past, what we've done is we've shown multiple locations and had people estimate the damage at those various locations. And some are 2 days away from the initial forecast, and some are 4 days away from the forecast. I'm going to move this up here, and I'll start by showing you some of the data from that 4-day time point. And this is our damage rating scale, going from 1 no damage to 7 severe damage. And this is what individuals' damage ratings look like. The first thing that I'd like to point out to you is that there is a steep drop off in damage that just so happens to correspond with locations inside or outside of the cone. But essentially, people are believing that there would be high damage inside the cone and very steep drop off in damage just outside of the cone, which is indicative of them seeing a danger zone and a safe zone. Now, if we do the same process for the ensemble, plot our damage rating scores, looks like this. And this just so happens to look a bit like a normal distribution with 3 standard deviations. We don't see an inside-outside effect. In some ways, we're getting an indication that they appreciate the uncertainty in the distribution. And to be clear, we're asking them about damage, even though we're showing them the path of the storm, because damage is a judgment that includes uncertainty, is sufficiently complex, and will give us a sense of how they think that the distribution changes away from the center of the storm, and because of some statistical properties that related to hitting a particular location that we wanted to avoid. We didn't want to ask participants what's the likelihood that the storm would hit a particular location, because of the way probability works, that there's never 100% probability of that. So that's why we focused on damage for these ratings. Okay, so we can do the same thing for the second time point. Here, this is 2 days away from the forecast. I'll bring that down. And this is what their damage ratings look like. Again, we're seeing this inside outside of the cone effect, where they're dropping off their damage dramatically from areas inside or outside of the cone. And interestingly, what is going on is that rather than appreciating that we're more certain about where the storm will be in 2 days from the forecast rather than 4 days, what they're indicating here is they're just scaling down their damage ratings. They just think there's going to be less damage, but overall in the same shape, which doesn't make a lot of sense. If we do the same thing with the ensemble, it just so happens that their pattern of response looks like a normal distribution with 1 standard deviation. And what this is indicating to us is that they are aware that we are more certain about where the storm will be in 2 days versus 4 days, based on the nature of the distributions in their responses, which is excellent. So this is giving us some indication that when they see the ensemble, they at least are able to appreciate the uncertainty that we're intending to convey and how that uncertainty is actually growing over time. Okay. So when we compare these visualizations, what we see from this study and all of our subsequent studies is that people see a danger zone and a safe zone. They're very worried if the cone covers anywhere that they care about, but if the cone just misses it, they're going to feel like they're fine. But with this ensemble, they understand the distribution of probability that we're intending to convey. So this is some of our evidence that these intervals create conceptual categories where people, they know that the probability of a storm isn't all or nothing, but when we show it to them with a cone, it forces them to think about distributional data categorically, which can be a big problem. Okay, and why is that the case? There's a researcher named Barbara Tversky, and she writes, framing a picture is a way of saying that what is inside the picture has a different status than what is outside of the picture. And I think if you're someone in the regular public and you see a data visualization where there's a hard boundary around information, you would assume that the researcher or designer is trying to convey to you that there's something special about the data inside versus outside. But with these confidence intervals, the exact location of the interval is entirely arbitrary. There's nothing special about 95%. We could pick 94, 96, etc. But when you see that as a viewer, it feels as if there's something entirely different about things inside the boundary than outside. Okay, so that's an example of how the visual information itself is really driving some of our decisions. And so you have to think very carefully about how you go about selecting that visual information. The next two cognitive science topics I want to talk about is a term called working memory, and another one is a graph schema. I'll give you an example of the relationship between those two. Okay, this is a type of figure that I think everyone on this meeting is very familiar with looking at. This one shows the growth of species X over time and when a predator species was introduced into the ecosystem. Now, if you're the general public, you're going to incorrectly think that the introduction of the predator species correlated with a drop in the population of species X. Everyone on this meetup can see why that is exactly wrong. That is because the y-axis is incorrectly ordered. But what I want you to do is I want you to, in your mind, mentally flip the visualization such that the y-axis is correctly ordered with lower numbers at the bottom and higher numbers at the top. I want you just to give it a try and imagine what the data would look like in your mind. Okay, if you can do it, it looks like this. And of course, you all see that the predator species correlated with a rise in the population of species X. This obviously was highly motivated by the very infamous visualization that used the same principles. Okay, why am I showing you this? You have this visualization, right? And you have this graph schema or conventions or rules or strategies that you've learned to understand graphs. And in this case, our graph conventions, our schema, suggests that lower numbers should be lower and higher numbers should be higher on the y-axis. And if the visualization does not match our expectations or our schema, we have to do a mental transformation to make them align. And you all tried that transformation and noticed that it was hard. It is an effortful thing to do. And it requires working memory. Working memory is the cognitive science way of saying that we're deliberately applying effort to do something in our mind. So this is really the relationship between this idea of a schema and working memory. When our expectations don't match the visualization that we see, we have to do some kind of translation in our mind to correct that information and help us understand it correctly. And it's effortful, and not everyone will do it. So that's how these two things go together. Okay, so in terms of schema, what are we seeing for these hurricane forecasts? The interesting thing is that when people see these hurricane forecasts, the cones, they think they represent the size of the storm growing over time. And they don't show anything about size whatsoever. And we can give people instructions. We tell them it doesn't show the size. The National Hurricane Center now has a label on their figures saying that it doesn't show the size of the storm growing. But it's very hard to get people away from that interpretation. because the cone is literally getting larger as it travels over space. So our question is, why is that happening? Well, we think it has something to do with the schema. We are showing people a map, and they are using the schema that they've learned for maps, which suggests that physical area, any type of pixel width that you have, can be translated into physical distance in the world. When we're little and we're taught to use maps, we're often taught to take our little ruler out and we can measure distances and do a calculation to approximate the distance in the physical world. In order to interpret these correctly, people would have to suppress a lifetime of map use, say, okay, I'm not going to think about physical width as physical width. I'm going to map it onto something abstract like uncertainty in the storm's path. And that's really hard. It requires effort, even if people know to do it. So in this way, there is a mismatch. We're essentially asking people to use a schema for the map as the base map, and then a whole entirely different schema for the visualization that's overlaid on top of it. So there's a mismatch there that can produce errors. Okay, so that's pretty good. We think we have a sense of why we're seeing these pretty resilient errors. For this ensemble visualization, my collaborators had just came up with it. So it's reasonable to assume that people didn't have a schema for that type of visualization. And now, learning about the problems with schemas, I wanted to determine what type of schema people use when they see one of these ensembles with the lines. So I reviewed all the visualization techniques out there, and it occurred to me that the ensemble shares similar properties to map-based navigation applications like this. And we've learned some conventions or schemas for interpreting these map-based applications. You're shown multiple routes to the same location. They are a finite, discrete set of routes, and you can take one route, but not another. If people were to use that same strategy to interpret this ensemble display, they would be quite wrong. What we are not showing people is a list of every single path the hurricane could take, an exhaustive list. This is really just sampled from probabilistic space. We're sampling about 200 points, but if we sampled 1,000,000 points, there would be a line on every single point on this map based on how this normal sampling works. So that's our question is, do people use the schema that they've developed to understand these route-based applications to sort out these ensemble displays? I'm going to give you the most simple depiction of how that might be a problem in some cases. Here's a very simple hurricane forecast. There's 3 lines, and one of them hits your home. I want you to decide in your mind, what is the probability that the storm will hit your home? Just go ahead and take a moment and decide for yourself. Now, I'd be willing to say that you're all very smart people. So you probably first thought 33% and thought it was a trick, and so modified it in some way. So you have something in that range, but it's really hard to make this estimate if you don't know how this visualization is created. Okay, whatever, keep your prediction in your mind and compare it to this version. Is it more or less? Now, if you imagine these being distributions, the one on the right, your home is technically closer to the center of the distribution. But something feels extra scary about the version on the left where a single line is hitting your house. So this was the type of task that we presented to participants to try to see if there's something special where people think that the storm will actually travel down one of those lines or not. Okay, so we showed people 2 locations on a map with these ensembles and asked which location would receive the most damage, A or B. And every time we did this, we had one of the locations directly on top of one of the ensemble lines. I'll draw it here a little darker for you to see. Now, if people were always thinking that the closer location to the center of the distribution should receive the most damage, they ought to say B 100% of the time. And yes, they say B almost 100% of the time. But if we change the scenario where the further location happens to be intersected by one of the lines, what do people do? Well, if they truly thought that the closer location to the center of the distribution should receive the most damage, they should say B 100% of the time. If they really think that the hurricane might travel down that one exact path and hit A, they'll say A some portion of the time. People say A 36% of the time and B 64% of the time. So we do have some indication that people sincerely believe that even the one path out of 200 that the storm might actually follow that path. And to be clear, when we do these studies, we're rarely telling people how to interpret these visualizations. We want to know their pure instinctual interpretation, mostly because time is a commodity and we can't expect everyone, no matter how much we want people to have better data visualization literacy, not everyone is going to have the time to get training or read instructions, especially in these cases where we're having hazard visualizations that should be the most helpful to people that are the most vulnerable. We want to ensure that they're as easy to understand as possible before forcing people to get additional training. Okay, so we do have some indication that the schema people are using to understand these ensemble displays are in some way based on the route-based navigation applications. This leads me to my second big concept, is that when there is a schema misalignment, that's when we're really seeing quite a bit of errors. And we find this in my work and various other studies as well. When you're asking someone to use a strategy that is different than the one that is naturally evoked from the visualization, they're going to have problems doing that. So be wary when you're making a new visualization technique that you're not accidentally evoking a strategy that is not useful for that particular task based on kind of what the visualization looks like. Okay, the next part I want to move on to, again, we're start thinking about working memory, which is effort. But now we'll talk a little bit more about decision making and how people use this to actually make real decisions. Okay, to be clear, I've danced around this topic a little bit, but these visualizations are summaries of distributions, and these are distributions of distributions. And one of the questions we had was that with the summaries, with the intervals and ratios, you are processing the distributional information for people in advance. And it could be that there's some tasks where it would be more useful to have that distributional data. So it could be that what they're having to do is remap on the distribution after you've averaged it for them. So we're trying to pick apart if some of these might be easier to use for some decision-making tasks. And this is really inspired by work that I did with some collaborators at the Red Cross. And they told me about a scenario where in 2005, there was a cold snap in the high mountains of Peru. And this resulted in just under 100,000 alpacas dying from cold temperatures. And their task was to help the farmers in this area by creating forecast-based financing systems in which there would be aid automatically issued to these farmers under certain conditions. But they had to decide about what those conditions would be. When do they set up their system to automatically issue aid? And then how to convey that to the farmers in case there was a false positive where they, decided to issue aid and they shouldn't, or vice versa. And what the aid looked like was actually blankets for these alpacas to keep them warm. So we presented a task to participants online, in this case, to simulate the type of scenario that the Red Cross workers were put in. And we told people, assume that you work at the Red Cross and your job is to manage resources for farms in Peru. In previous years, alpacas have died in Peru from cold temperatures. Alpacas can typically withstand the cold unless the temperature drops below 32 degrees. Your job is to consider the forecast and determine if the nighttime low will drop below freezing, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, in which you should issue blankets to these alpacas. Okay, that's the general context. Now I want to think about how people might do this with these two types of distributional visualizations. And the task, just to boil it down, is what is the probability that the temperature will be 32 degrees or lower? If we try to do that task with a density plot on top, what we would do is we would find 32 degrees and mentally calculate the integral under the curve. which is next to impossible to do with this density. And to be clear, it would be even harder to do with an interval, but for this density plot, it's quite challenging. If we use a quantile dot plot, the nice thing is that we can get closer to these approximations without having to do this complex mental math. For example, each one of these dots represents a 5% probability. So you could count up 5, 10, 15% probability, and you would guess there's somewhere between 15 and 20% probability that the nighttime temperature will be 32 degrees or below, which is really excellent. And one of the things to point out between the differences between these two is that the top graph, the density plot, uses probabilistic framing. So it frames things such as 10%, whereas the quantile dot plot uses frequency framing. For example, it would frame it as 1 out of 10. And there is a vast body of research in psychology and behavioral economics that demonstrates it is easier for us to think about frequency framing, because that's how we experience probability in the world, versus this kind of abstract notion of 10%. For example, you might take a route to work and you might think there's traffic on that particular drive 2 out of 5 times. That is a frequency framing. If you converted that to a probability, then you'd be thinking in terms of probability. And I don't think anyone actually would do that calculation in their head. They think about it in terms of frequencies. So this is the quantile dot plot is the visual analog to that frequency framing approach. And of course, the cool part about all of these distributional visualizations is we can work backwards with a cumulative distribution function and find the exact value of, or the exact probability at any given value. In this case, it's 16%. And we estimated between a 15 and 20% likelihood that the storm will, or that the forecasted nighttime low will be 32 degrees or below. So we're pretty close when the actual probability was 16%. Okay. So in this particular task, we also had a correct answer. That's not always the case with my experiments, but in this one, we wanted a correct answer. And the way we set that up is we had a budget that we gave people. So we gave people an 18-day budget, and they had $18,000 in this hypothetical budget. The blankets cost $1,000 per night to issue to the alpaca farmers. There was a penalty for not issuing the blankets if the temperature dropped below 32 degrees. And they received an extra 10 cents for every $1,000 left in their budget. So they were very incentivized to do this correctly. Now, because of this cost-benefit analysis, we can find the correct answer for any given probability and any given standard deviation of these distributions, which we did manipulate a little bit. So what I'm going to show you in terms of the results is accuracy, because we could figure that out explicitly in this experiment. Okay, so for this experiment, we wanted to test some visualization categories that should be familiar to you at this point. We have some distributional annotations and some summary annotations. For the summary annotations, we had a 95% confidence interval plot around a mean forecasted temperature. We also had a text table expressing the same information as in the confidence interval plot, and then a mean plot as a control, which had no uncertainty at all, because we want to know what's their accuracy if they don't get shown any uncertainty. When we set this up, we showed different groups of participants different visualizations like this. They only saw one visualization type, and there was 150 people per group. We did this online. And we did some other manipulations to the stimuli where we changed the variance of these distributions, and we also changed the mean temperatures as well. So they made in total 18 judgments for this alpaca task. Okay, and the other thing that's going to be probably new to most people is we wanted to get a measure of their working memory capacity. I've talked about working memory a little bit so far, and it's this ability to do effortful things. And measuring working memory allows us to measure the amount of effort someone might have in a particular task. And we actually have different capacities. There's people with high working memory capacity and low working memory capacity. What we're going to do with this experiment is look at people with high and low working memory capacity and see if maybe some of these visualizations are really hard for people with low working memory capacity. That'll give us an indication if it takes a lot of effort. So first, we actually have to measure their working memory capacity. And this is something that's pretty standard in cognitive science. And I'll show you how it works. It's called an O span. And what we do is we show people a math problem for 5 seconds, and they have to do the math problem. And the answer is the math problem true or correct. And then they see an image that they have to remember the sequence of. And they do another math problem, and then they see an image, math problem, image, and they're trying to remember the sequence in which they were shown the image. And at the end, they have to recall the order in which those images were presented to them. They're just going to click in the order that they were shown. And what this tells us is someone's ability to store these pictures in their mind while doing a math problem, which gives us an indication of how much working memory or how much ability they have to do these really effortful types of tasks. And this correlates with neurological studies, brain imaging studies that indicates that we have these different capacities. So we have a measure, essentially, if people have high or low working memory capacity using one of these. The example I showed you, people had to remember the sequence of 4 items, but then we increase it to 5, 6, and so on, because we want to find the max, their highest level of amount of stuff they can store in their mind. Okay, in total, they answered 30 questions and did 30 math problems, and we weighted these so we had a measure of if people were sincerely doing the math problem and this image remembering task at the same time. And the data I'm going to show you is split into high and low working memory groups. Okay, so here is what the data looks like. The first thing I want to point out to you is the coloring is based on this O span task, and O refers to the number. So you could have a 4 span, 5 span, 6 span, etc. The low working memory group is in purple. The high working memory group is in green, and accuracy is on that alpaca task. So you can see how well people performed. And what these are posterior distributions from a Bayesian analysis. The way to look at these is they're different if they're further apart. And the more apart they are, the bigger magnitude of the effect. Okay, so right out of the gate, the first things I want to point out are the 2 types of visualizations that had the best accuracy for both high and low working memory groups were the distributional visualizations. These were the quantile dot plots and the densities. So that's interesting. One might have made a prediction that maybe text could have been useful. There's some researchers out there who think that text is easier to use, but we don't find that to be the case. Yep. Next thing I want to point out is that there's actually a meaningful difference between individuals in high and low working memory groups for the quantile dot plots and for the means. Let me interpret the first one for you. So this here is the people who had high working memory capacity with the quantile dot plots. They performed better than everyone else, significantly better than those with low working memory capacity. They're just doing the best, which is really interesting. And the other one I'll point out is individuals with low working memory capacity, when they just saw that mean plot, they didn't see any uncertainty, they're performing the worst, significantly worse than those with high working memory capacity in that group, but also worse than everyone else as well. If you have low working memory capacity, it's actually really useful for you to see that uncertainty information. Now, I'm going to show you the same data, but I'm going to compare the different groups directly so you can get a better sense of this. Okay, on the left, we have high working memory group, and on the right, low working memory group. And I'll just highlight these here. And what this plot is indicating to you is that the quantile dot plots were meaningfully better than the mean, than the text, than the intervals, and then the density plot if you had high working memory. So if you had high working memory, the quantile dot plot is the way to go. Now coming over here, both the quantile dot plot and the density plot performed better than the mean, text, and interval, which is really interesting. But I want to point out that if you have low working memory capacity, you are performing the same if you have a quantile dot plot or a density plot, meaning that you're going to treat them the same. Even if you get that quantile dot plot, you're not going to be able to access the additional information that's in there. You're just going to treat it like a density plot. It's still better than the other visualizations, but only when you have high working memory capacity can you access that additional information that is in the quantile dot plot, which is pretty cool. So this ultimately is giving us an indication that with distributional data, consider using distributional visualizations when you can. In this work and other work as well finds that these distributions tend to be really effective, even though people are nervous that the average public might be overwhelmed or it might be too much information for them. We tend to see when they actually do real tasks with these visualizations, performance is excellent, even for people that have low working memory capacity and you think they would be the most hindered by the additional information. That's not what we see here. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is where I began with COVID data. And I actually don't know where it is on my little model here because it is a very complex decision-making task that likely involves all parts of our cognitive process. So here is a figure from a paper we recently published. And essentially what happened to us back in October of 2020 is, like everyone else, we were a little blindsided by COVID. And no one at that time had studied pandemic forecast visualizations. And a little naively, we thought that the COVID wouldn't last very long. And so we wanted to do a study looking at every type of COVID visualization we could come up with because we would never have this chance again. So what we did is we created stimuli in October of 2020 for people in California. And we have some different types of categories of groups that we looked at. So first of all, we had some controls. First, we had a control that had no forecast information at all, just the historical data from California. We had a version with the mean and no uncertainty. We also had some summary visualizations that I've talked about at length at this point, and some distributional visualizations as well. And these visualizations were honestly those that were just convenient for us to test immediately, assuming again that COVID was going to disappear. So this is real COVID data. We didn't manipulate anything about it. These are the actual forecasts in their kind of unmanipulated form. And in this process, we noticed that there was a little bit of a difference between an incident y-axis, where over a certain interval, the deaths or whatever you're plotting would be counted up. In this case, it's a 2-week interval. That's what you're seeing here. In contrast to a cumulative axis, which adds up everything over time. So it's always going to be going up and up. So we thought we would test both of those and see how people interpret them. Now, this particular study had 16 groups. It was the largest study I've ever been a part of. And we did this online with people who currently lived in California. And we were able to get a representative sample, meaning that all of the demographics in terms of age, gender, education level, et cetera, were actually mapped to the US population. So our data is fairly representative of the population in the US, at least. Now, I'm not going to show you the data from all of these, but I'm going to pick out some of the most interesting ones to highlight. Okay, so here we have an incident y-axis with a 50% confidence interval. And you can plot the exact same data with a cumulative axis, and it looks like this. Of course, the intervals are quite small. We can show people 6 expertly selected models, and we had a forecasting or a modeling expert on our team, and she selected these models based on their initial assumptions. So not necessarily about their spread, but about the assumptions they made in terms of COVID. That's how these 6 were selected. We can do the same thing with the cumulative axis. And of course, they're going to be grouped on each other because this was quite certain that the deaths would be increasing in California. We can show all of the models in an attempt to see if this affects people with an incident axis, and then same thing with the cumulative. Okay. Types of questions that we asked people were, we wanted to get a sense of how they interpreted the risk for themselves and for other people. We asked them a total of 12 questions, and an example of one of the questions is, how often do you think each of the following people will come in contact with someone currently infected with COVID-19 in the next 2 weeks? And they made that decision for themselves, an average 22-year-old in their state and an average 78-year-old person in their state. Our thought was that we wanted to get an estimate of if their judgments changed for a younger person or someone that would be more susceptible to COVID. And we asked similar questions about the possibility of contracting COVID, having severe adverse effects from COVID, and being hospitalized by COVID. Okay. So those were the types of questions that we asked people. We had them do this risk judgment at the very beginning of the study, and then we showed them one of the visualizations for 2 minutes, and then they did the exact same risk judgment. Now they weren't allowed to proceed. They just looked at the visualization for 2 minutes. And I will be the first to say that I didn't think this experiment would work. I didn't think that by just showing people a visualization for 2 minutes, they would change their beliefs about the COVID risk to themselves and others. We were all in lockdown at this point, and I assumed that people had an internal belief about their COVID risk, and it wouldn't be changeable by data visualizations. So this was really a tall order that we were asking of these visualizations. Our original idea was just to kind of see how people interpreted them. We didn't necessarily think that people would change their judgments. But in addition to this risk estimates, we have lots of other data from people, including their age, gender, education. There were 20 COVID-19 risk factors that the CDC issued. So we have measures of everyone's health risk factors. We have a graph literacy score, their knowledge about COVID, if they had contracted COVID or been tested for COVID. The results I'm about to show you on the next page are taking into account all of these significant predictors, and all of these definitely matter. If you're interested more on some of these individual differences measures, the paper that we just published has, I think, a 50-page supplemental material that breaks down all of these very meaningful factors that impact people's risk judgments. But this data here is accounting for those. So what I'm showing you at first is the data from the cumulative y-axis. And this is our risk rating scale from 1 to 7. Here's the data before they saw the visualization. And here is the data after they saw the visualizations. What I'd like to point out is for these two visualization types, the visualization increased their risk perception, suggesting that after they viewed the visualization, their beliefs about the risk to themselves and others increased. It changed from this 2-minute exposure. And we didn't see any meaningful impact here. There is some movement, but statistically, we can't say that this is a significant difference. So this is actually quite interesting to us, that the two distributional visualizations, you'll remember that I keep harping on that were the ones that had the most ability to change people's perceptions. Okay, we can compare this to the incident y-axis. And actually, let me step back. I drew in these dotted lines here, and what the dotted lines actually represent are all the visualizations that we tested for this group, not just the ones I'm showing you in this particular plot. So you have a sense of what the average was across all of the visualizations in this group. Okay. We can do the same thing for the incident y-axis, and there was really no meaningful impact of visualization exposure. The only peculiar thing that happened was for the 50% confidence interval, people actually decreased their risk estimates. So they in some ways became more risky or were less nervous about COVID when they saw that 50% confidence interval, which is probably not the direction that we want to be nudging people around. But I'm sure you're noticing that the biggest difference is the increase in risk perception for this cumulative axis versus this incident axis. So, why is that happening? If we go back to our visualizations, I think some of you probably saw it in the beginning, but we didn't appreciate that this was going to be such a big influencer. So at the time in California, the incident Y scaling data happened to be going down and the cumulative just so happened to be going up. It could have been the case that if we ran this experiment on August 1st or, 4 weeks earlier, that the incident axis would also be going up. This is real COVID data. We're not manipulating it. So the data is what it is. So essentially we had a confound in our experiment. And what we did at this point, it was December of 2020, we started looking at the COVID data again, and it occurred to us that in California, the incident data at this time was going up and the cumulative data was going up as well. But in New York, many of you will remember that New York had a very early spike in COVID. And this resulted in both their incident data being relatively flat. There's still a little bit of an uptick, but comparative to that large spike, the data is pretty flat. Same for the cumulative y-axis. So this gives us a really interesting way to compare people in New York who were online but lived in New York and people from California. So we reran the exact same study to determine if it's truly about this incident versus cumulative axis, or is it really just about that upward slope driving people's decisions? Okay, so here's the data from that. And I'm putting all the plots here so you can remember which one's which. To begin, for people in New York, we didn't find meaningful impact of the visualizations, suggesting that because the data was relatively flat, people were inclined to change their judgments. They thought that their estimates are pretty stable and they were okay with that. But for individuals in California who had that steeper upward slope, they were the ones who were likely to believe they were more at risk after viewing the visualizations than before viewing the visualizations. And importantly, we were able to replicate the previous finding that with the distributional visualizations, those are the ones that are influencing people the most. They're pushing people's judgments around more. So that leads us to a final conclusion here, which is that with the cumulative y-axis, it leads to more variable judgments than the incident y-axis. And there's a few ways to interpret this. In terms of visualization recommendations, this is ultimately up to risk communicators. I'm not going to be the one saying, do we want people to be more nervous or less nervous? What I do know from this research is that an incident y-axis is very susceptible to artificial changes in risk. For example, a COVID testing site might open and all of a sudden you see a steep upward trend, or it's a holiday and no one's getting tested and you see a steep downward trend. So the information about risk that's being conveyed by those visualizations might not always be reflective of the true risk, and our beliefs about our risk are very influenced by those trends. So essentially it produces these variable judgments that may or may not be desirable, whereas the cumulative y-axis has a more stable impact on our risk estimates. The other thing we find, again, with all of our visualizations, is that these distributional data, consider using distributional visualizations. So we find it fairly consistently, and other researchers find it as well. Now, there may be cases where you don't want people to think about the uncertainty. Maybe it would be useful to have people thinking about the data categorically. In that case, fine, go ahead and use an interval, but just know that that's how people will be interpreting your data as categorical if you do use an interval. The other thing we learned is that schema misalignments causes errors. So don't expect people to be able to suppress the schema that's naturally evoked by the visualization and use another one unless you're ready to prepare and train them pretty extensively to do so. And finally, intervals create conceptual categories. And this, again, is something that is fairly prevalent in this uncertainty research that we do and other people do as well. Okay, with that, I wanted to thank all my many collaborators. These are the two papers that I highlighted the most. The top one reviews uncertainty visualizations. The bottom one has some more of the cognitive science, if that is of interest to you. The paper on COVID that came out just a few weeks ago, I have some really fantastic co-authors working on that with me, and you can really dig into more of the findings if that's interesting to you, if you're someone interested in COVID visualizations. If you want to know just generally more about this empirical research in data visualizations, this paper also just came out that reviews really all of the empirical evidence out there, and it is in a very digestible form. So please take a look at that if that is of interest to you. And in closing, I hope I've given you lots of evidence that the way uncertainty is presented truly has a profound influence on our judgments. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much, Lace. You can see from the chat that people really enjoyed it. At this point, we will take questions, and Cameron is going to lead the Q&A.
Yeah, so if you haven't asked your question yet, please use the Zoom button. But first, yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful and detailed presentation. I'm going to try and group some of the questions that are related, be respectful of everyone's time. So there were a couple questions about graph schemas. People were wondering about how inherent they are. There was questions about size, whether they're related to global schemas that people have about size, or up being more, down being less, or the impact of the English language. Could you comment a little bit more about yeah, graph schemas and where people get them from?
Yes, that is such a good question. So I think, to be honest, there's not a lot of empirical work to demonstrate how we create graph schemas, where they come from, what's influencing them. They're in data visualizations. There's work in other fields of cognitive science that suggests they are highly related to language, as one of the questions proposes. And different types of language might have different metaphors that would describe the world. So there could be differences between different languages based on the metaphors they use. There are some physical metaphors that are universal, that are based on our physical world. That is actually one of the reasons I really like these quantile dot plots here. Just zoom up on it so you can see it. It's because they, in some ways, relate to a physical metaphor of maybe dropping something on a horizon line. If you had a bunch of cotton balls and you drop them in your hand, there would be a higher point and they would kind of decrease off to the side. So in some ways, this kind of looks like a stack of something that we would see in the world. And we would understand that the highest point in some way relates to the most likely. So I think it's a really cool visualization technique that has a physical metaphor that helps us understand it pretty effectively. The density plot does, do I have the density? The density plot does a little bit, but it's still kind of an abstraction in some ways. So I think there's some visualizations that are particularly excellent, like this one, that just so happen to map on physical metaphors. So that's one way that we can have a schema develop kind of accidentally from experience in the world. But I think that other schemas that we have are based on education and experience with graphs. I think graphs, like reading, are something that we learn to do mostly, unless we so happen to see something like this that is representing something, could be representing something physical. So we really learn them, and we're essentially tied to some of the historical graphs that are taught to children and the general public. And I think that is unfortunate if you're wanting to innovate and make something new and interesting. But I think it's smart to appreciate that people's judgments will be biased towards those types of graphs that they are deliberately taught to use in school. But I would love to do more research on just how we develop schemas, if we can train people to get new schemas, or if you come up with a crazy new visualization, how they would sort of pull something else, some other type of experience to help inform their interpretation of that. It's unclear how that happens exactly.
That's a great answer. It makes me also think about some discussion around the directions arrows have on graph-related emoji and cultural differences about whether the red line going up is good or bad news. But yeah, so next we have a question about rain cloud plots. Are you familiar with those, or have anything to comment about them?
I haven't studied them myself, but I could speculate if you pushed me.
Yeah, so people are wondering about how effective you consider them, I guess, especially in comparison to the other methods you've shown here.
I'm not sure. So I will say what I generally don't speculate on is how effective a visualization might be if it hasn't been tested, because there's some cases, for example, with the cone of uncertainty, where unexpected things happened and we wouldn't have predicted it going in. So many people, including ourselves, would think that this visualization would be the best, this kind of blurry boundary, because it kind of has this metaphorical feeling of uncertainty and it's showing a distribution, which is good. But we still see that it shows people think it shows the size of the storm growing over time. And we've tested this in many, many dozens of ways of representing hurricanes. And surprisingly, this one is not the most effective. One, because it still has that metaphor of size going in. And just from a graphic standpoint, it's actually quite hard to get this blur to work without this artifact of banding. So people still will see bands depending on their display. Some of you might see this and see bands on your display right now. So if we hadn't have tested this, I would have said, this is the best visualization technique. It seems obvious, but it was only through testing that we observed some peculiar errors. So I can't really speculate on the rain cloud plot, because there might be something unintuitive that happens when you actually test people, and that's pretty hard to predict. Sorry for that unsatisfying answer.
If I can piggyback off of something you commented on, when you mentioned how it was lucky with the alpaca task, that there was a definition of correctness. What do you do when the task doesn't have that kind of definition?
Which is 85% of my studies. So we have to make some inferences based on what people respond with. With these hurricanes, we're asking people, what their damage ratings are, and there's no true right answer for damage in these cases. But what we do see is the difference between their damage ratings for this and this and this. So we can compare across these visualizations. We can't necessarily say this visualization is better or worse. We can see if maybe there's a peculiar error that is produced, but it very much limits our interpretation of the results. And I think some people would find that frustrating. I don't mind that, because in the world, there's very few right answers. So in some ways, we're simulating more honest types of judgments that people would make. The same with COVID. I alluded to this with these COVID visualizations, but I don't know what the right answer is in terms of what people should be doing when interpreting this. Should we want people to feel that they're under more risk than before? I don't have that right answer. It probably varies based on the individual's experience. What we do know is that some of these visualizations push people's judgments around more than others. And it's a more of an ethical question from that risk communicators need to grapple with, and in terms of how to use that information, because it is a very powerful tool, these data visualizations. Again, not a very satisfying answer, but
Thank you. So next we have a couple questions from Erska and other people wondering about how you produce these visualizations, if you have recommendations about programs or libraries.
So I work with experts who use all sorts of different types of things. These were produced by the Reich Lab, And I think these are done in D3. The hurricane ones were all done, I think, in some specialized program that they built. The more simplistic ones, these ones, were done in R. So there's just kind of a wide range. I think you could really do any of these in whatever programming software you're comfortable with. Some of them are more easier than others. If you're using R, there's Matthew Kay has developed some really excellent new packages to make these types of distributional visualizations much easier. He's my collaborator here. He's doing really fantastic work in developing R packages that make the job of using distributional data quite a bit easier. But really anything, any way you want to go would be fine.
That's great to hear, and hopefully encouraging to people who are coming from all different programming backgrounds or not programming in this group.
Mm-hmm.
So Leah is wondering about the idea of mapping transparency or other visual encodings to confidence interval.
I think that's a great intuition. And have I seen any work that's done that? Matt and Jessica might have done something where they're looking at two encodings together. He certainly has some really cool tutorials and vignettes where he does that. But I would say one of the things to think about, again, I'll zoom up on this figure, is something like this that has, this is a contour box plot that's plotted over a map. And so what's going on here is there's different transparencies and then these kind of outlier simulations. So one of the things to think about when you're representing uncertainty is that people don't like uncertainty. And if people can avoid it, they will. So if you give them the opportunity to focus on this mean line and ignore this other information, they will probably do that. When you're thinking about layering this information, generally where people go is they add on a mean to a distribution, or they make the edges of the distribution more transparent. And I think all of those are really good, but I think if you can avoid doing something like giving someone the mean line to avoid them just focusing on that and ignoring everything else, I think that would be a really smart approach. But certainly I think adding some transparency to these would be really great. I highly recommend having people confront the uncertainty, and they may not like it, but it will usually help them with their interpretations. Yeah, just as a kind of a side note, I think if we get more comfortable dealing with uncertainty, that's really the way to make us resilient to all of these things that are going to happen in the next 10 and 20 years. We are going to be in a world that is more uncertain, and having people become comfortable right now seeing the uncertainty, even in data that they might not think would have uncertainty, I think will be baby steps towards making us resilient to those scenarios where there is extreme uncertainty.
I think that's definitely a very actionable and important message. I noticed there's one question I feel like the answer might be similar, but would you caveat that any differently if someone were using hue or color instead of transparency? Is it like the positionalness of the encoding that really helps with the line, or yeah?
I think that would be okay. I'm imagining a situation where you accidentally focus people's attention on a mean by having, a color encoding where red, like a very high Q red, is here. And so it's like very distinct, and it's as if you have a mean line drawn in here, but it's just color. Maybe avoid that type of interpretation or that type of visualization, but I don't see color being that much of a problem unless you need to think deeply about cultural differences and think about the implications of those colors for different cultures. That could be potentially tricky. You see most of my plots not in color because I'm doing risk visualizations, and we're trying to make these visualizations in such a way where we could distribute them to people all around the world. And this might seem, crazy because we're all on Zoom and we have computers, but there's some places that are at most need of decision support where they will print out a physical map in black and white and hand it to people. I did some work with individuals who are doing disaster management in Haiti and trying to optimize hurricane forecasts for them. And I thought, we know a lot about nice visualizations to make people understand this information more effectively. It turns out on the western coast of Haiti that's most affected by hurricanes, they don't have access to printers or phones or radio or anything because it's been so decimated by storms. There's a man who rides out on his motorcycle and he raises a hurricane flag to tell them that a hurricane is approaching. And they have 5 different colors of those flags that happen to correspond to these distinctions that the National Hurricane Center has made that they know nothing about. So they have no clue what those colors mean. They just see a flag go up and then a hurricane's coming. So I think appreciating the people that would most benefit from your information might add some additional constraints that I think we should all deeply consider. And I'm not saying don't use color, but I definitely think consider making it usable for the people that would most benefit from decision support.
That is a fascinating anecdote.
Yeah.
Thought about flag as a way to deliver decision support. That's really cool.
It was shocking to us because, what do you do to improve that? If that's all they have access to, how do you improve that? Do I have? Used to have a slide. Oh, hey, yeah. So one of the things that we did is this was the flag that they had. And what we recommended to do was to get rid of the multicolor flag system and have a single flag that they painted in order to have a culturally meaningful message that they needed to evacuate. Because it turns out they don't need to know the different severity of the storms because the infrastructure was so decimated in this area. If any storm came, it was detrimental. So they got confused when there was these different flag colors. So we wanted them to get rid of the flag colors, have a single culturally appropriate message. And this fit our decision constraints, which from the Haitian government was that they would implement any of our recommendations if they didn't require any money to do it. So this was a solution that didn't require any money. And the reason I have this little diagram here is it is kind of indicating the approach that I like to take in these situations, which is if you're trying to ensure that, a group of people can equally access information, you find that there's an issue, you can see that each of these people are kind of standing on a box here and they can't, view the soccer game. What some people do is they try to provide additional support so that an individual could access the information. In our case, what that would be training all the Haitians to understand the category hurricane system produced by the National Hurricane Center, right? That seemed kind of silly to do. Instead, we just changed the visualization, changed the information to not negatively impact anyone, to be easier for everyone to understand. And then we didn't have to provide additional support to some people. So that's generally my approach when I'm thinking about working with different populations, is to ensure that it works for everyone rather than having to provide special support for some groups.
I think that's a spectacular outcome and one that a lot of accessibility work hopefully gets to highlight, that it ultimately benefits everyone and not just a subset, which can be a misconception. All right, so we have about 10 more minutes to our scheduled time. We'll probably wrap up within then, but we'll keep going with the questions until then. So Yang Zhao is wondering about in the ensemble models displays, whether there's a weighting applied to quality or some other feature of the models, or should we assume that they're all equally credible or weighted?
And these, the ones that I showed you, they're all equally credible, but I wish I had a slide of this. My collaborators came up with a better way to do this, where they recreated this distribution with around 10 different lines. And then each of the lines actually does have a slightly different weighting based on where it falls in the distribution. And by recreating this distribution, what they did is they allowed it, they don't have to have these kind of crazy lines that are just sampled. They're these kind of smooth lines that make a fan. And they made the lines a little bit bigger so that they could add in the intensity of the storm in color. And then on top of that, they added the size of the storm with a glyph. So you could actually see the uncertainty in the path, the intensity, and the size of the storm. And in that case, there was slightly different weighting to the paths. But this one, no, these are just random polls. And the information about probability is purely about conveyed based on where they're located on the map, how close, how densely packed they are in any given area.
It sounds like it would be good to check out the paper, but I'm curious if you have any initial reactions to whether spending visual encodings on those features is worth it for these tasks.
Yeah, okay, so there's always a cost-benefit analysis there, right? The National Hurricane Center, to be clear, they don't do this. They're not showing people this because they are unconvinced by our results a little bit, which is fair. What they really wanted us to do is to convey more information. They wanted people to have access to the size and intensity of the storm, and then ultimately the uncertainty and the speed, because, you know, this kind of implies that there's a set speed at which the storm moves, but that's not correct either. There's actually uncertainty around the speed. And so one of their asks to us was to find a way to show more of that information in a visualization, and maybe they would adopt it. So we decided to sacrifice some of those channels to get closer to something that they would be willing to implement as one of their visualization products. But it certainly is a little bit more to unpack. And I think it could use some more testing to determine if it was sincerely worth it. But I think that they communicate a lot, especially if you have multiple levels of decisions. Imagine your only decision is, do I need to evacuate from Louisiana? If you had all those three types of information all at once, you could probably make one of those judgments. There's some people who might need to know the exact size of the storm, and they could extract it from the visualization, or some people need to know about the speed. So it allows people to make interpretations by extracting different levels of information, which I think is nice. But I do think it needs some more testing to determine if it is truly worth it or not, to your point. I think it is, but there might be edge cases. As you've noticed, my work's a little different than maybe some of the others that you've seen because it's all about edge cases. I try to find situations where it doesn't work and explore why that is the case. And so the newer ensemble visualization, I haven't explored all those edge cases, so I don't know at what point it kind of breaks down, but it seems to be good if you haven't done that full exploration yet.
That makes sense. Actually, that's a decent segue to a couple questions that people had about interactivity in this space as maybe one way to manage those extra features or complexity. Someone mentioned AR, VR. Someone mentioned an app that lets you choose the level of uncertainty. So yeah, you have pointers to work that use interactivity to address some of the problems that you've mentioned.
I have talked to so many collaborators who are trying to use interactivity for uncertainty, and I don't know of any of it that has been published because it is so hard. It's hard. It's hard for a lot of reasons. Not everyone interacts with the visualization. Oftentimes, whatever pops up on the screen first as the default will just kind of bias their judgments. You know, when you're working with practitioners, and everyone in here would want to kind of play around with the parameters to kind of build up a sense of in their mind the uncertainty by playing with the data and exploring the data. testing people who like to do that is challenging based on the statistical models that we use. We essentially have to get large groups of people doing these things to determine if they're significantly different from one another. So it is very, very challenging to test to test interactivity. And I think that's why I haven't seen as much of it. But I think one of the most useful ways to convey uncertainty is like this, where it is not communicated explicitly, it's built up in someone's mind where they can get this kind of situational awareness of the amount of uncertainty. So allowing people to play around with the parameters, I think would be really excellent. Just intuitively, that would be my guess, to help them get a understanding of the way that different elements in a model might contribute or modify the uncertainty. So I think that's a really great intuition, but again, I don't have any empirical evidence that that is the case.
Seems like great work that perhaps people in this group might pursue at some point.
Yeah, and please let me know in the chat if anyone does know of that work. Maybe there's something I'm unfamiliar with that you all are familiar with.
Let's see. So Nor has a question about what to do when presenting data where uncertainty isn't quantifiable. Many of these examples have it quantified.
Yes, I love that question. So we have done work, and I guess another way to say that is with these COVID, maybe I'll just go to the top COVID models. Technically, if you're looking at this, each of these are an individual model. There's not necessarily uncertainty. We could add uncertainty around it, but another way to say this, or even this one's a little bit better, is that there's 7 different groups that have predicted different things. And so in your mind, you have to appreciate that there's disagreement. So I've worked with some studies where the uncertainty is unquantifiable, but people know that it's there. For example, they might believe that 2 experts aren't agreeing in some capacity, and they want to convey the lack of consensus in information, but that's something that's subjective and really hard to quantify. There's no hard numbers around, the lack of consensus in something. So what we found is that if you add caveats that include the level of forecaster confidence, for example, saying that these 7 experts are all highly confident in their prediction, or they have low confidence in their prediction, if you're adding on this extra layer of uncertainty that's subjective or unquantifiable, people can, at least in the one experiment that we've done, integrate that in some reasonable way, where their judgments become more variable and more cautious when we convey that the experts have low confidence in those particular models, which is good. Again, we haven't tested all the edge cases of that, so I can imagine there's situations where it goes quite wrong. But we didn't visualize the confidence. We just told people that there was a lack of confidence in those particular models. Another group that is kind of working in the same direction is the IPCC. The IPCC here has different forecast models. You are seeing some confidence intervals, but they have very standardized ways to convey uncertainty that can't be quantified directly. They have methods of indicating what maybe high, medium, and low uncertainty actually means, and systematic ways to come to those evaluations. So I would encourage you to take a look at the write-up they have on explaining the uncertainty in their models as maybe a starting point for attempting to operationalize uncertainty that can't be quantified directly. Good question.
There have been so many questions. I'm sure we could go on for hours and not run out of questions, but we said the program would be 6 to 7:30. So I cannot thank you enough, Lace, for your very, very informative talk. If you look at the comments, you will see how well received it was. Thank you, Randy, for hosting. Thank you, Cameron, for your excellent job in handling the questions. And thank all of you for coming. To answer the question that I answered in the beginning, but I will again, yes, it will be recorded. I will post the link under the comments. If you go to the New York website and you go to this event, in the comments below, you will see a link. It will probably be available in 3 or 4 days. Sometimes it takes longer, but the recording will be available. I thank you. There has been a request for some of the references you gave, Lace. If you send me a document with references, I can post that when I post the link to the recording.
Absolutely.
Any other comments or questions? If not, I thank you. I thank everybody involved, and especially Lace, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for your time. I had a really fun time. Everyone asked such good questions. It was really excellent group from all around the world. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. And thank all of you for coming.